My name is Lexi Mills. I'm 27 years old and a sergeant in the United States Army. Tonight, at the Charleston Army Ball, my dress uniform is stained with blood. Not the blood of an enemy, but my own, seeping from where my stepmother, Linda, scratched me as she dragged me across the marble floor. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were on us, but they couldn't see her nails digging into my flesh. In the deafening silence that followed a distant gunshot, she leaned in close, her voice as sweet as Carolina honey, but cold as steel. "You should have never gotten in my way. Your father would be so disappointed in his useless daughter." Those words hurt more than the gash on my arm. She thought she had won. But she didn't know that under my white glove, I had just activated an emergency protocol she could never have imagined. If you've ever been made to look like the bad guy by your own family in front of everyone, let me know where you're watching from, hit the like button, and subscribe. You need to hear the rest of this story. The air in the Gaillard Center ballroom was thick with the scent of money and power. A heady mix of expensive perfume, aged bourbon, and the faint, crisp smell of starched military uniforms. It was a symphony of Charleston's elite, a world Linda navigated with the grace of a shark gliding through water. I stood beside her, a prop in her meticulously crafted play, my posture ramrod straight as required by my training and demanded by her presence. Her hand was wrapped around my wrist, a gesture that looked supportive to the decorated two-star general we were speaking with, but I could feel each of her manicured nails pressing into my skin. It was a familiar pain, a private language of control she had perfected over 17 years. "My daughter is just so resilient, General," Linda said, her voice dripping with manufactured pride. Her smile was a perfect, dazzling white, aimed directly at him, never once faltering. Just like her father. She squeezed my wrist harder, punctuating the lie. I felt a tremor in her hand, a subtle vibration of excitement that betrayed her calm facade. It was the tremble of a predator closing in on its prey. I kept my eyes locked on the general's, my expression neutral. A mask of professional respect I had worn on countless missions. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. He saw a proud stepmother and her decorated daughter. I saw the tightening of a noose. Every compliment she paid me in public was just another twist of the rope, ensuring that when she finally pulled it taut, my fall would be that much more spectacular. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low hum of conversation faded into a dull roar in my ears. The only thing I could focus on was the rhythm of her breathing, the subtle shift in her grip, waiting for the axe to fall. It fell, not with a bang, but with a sudden, chilling silence. The master of ceremonies had just finished a toast to the armed forces when a man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit walked onto the stage. He wasn't part of the program. He moved with the quiet authority of federal law enforcement. He tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the cavernous hall like a gunshot. The room held its breath. "Sergeant Lexi Mills," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It cut through the silence, and I felt hundreds of pairs of eyes pivot toward me. My name, spoken not with honor, but as an indictment. "You are under investigation for a breach of national security." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I saw Linda's hand fly to her mouth, a perfect portrait of a shocked and devastated mother. Her performance was flawless. Whispers erupted, spreading like wildfire. "Her? She looks so innocent. John Mills's daughter. Unbelievable." The words were like tiny, sharp needles, pricking at the armor I'd spent a lifetime building. But my training and the memory of those long, cold nights on my father's pier had forged that armor from something stronger than steel. They saw a traitor. I saw a chessboard, every piece moved into place with cold, calculated precision. And I knew, somewhere in the shadows, my own pieces were finally beginning to move. Two military police officers, their faces grim and professional, began to make their way toward me through the stunned crowd. The sea of dress uniforms and evening gowns parted for them. My world shrank to the space between me and them, to the glint of the overhead chandeliers on the polished silver of the handcuffs they carried. The metallic click as one of the officers opened the cuffs was the only sound I could hear. It was the sound of my reputation being locked away. But then, something else cut through the noise in my head. A sound no one else could hear. 3 distinct, rhythmic clicks in my covert earpiece. Click, click, click. It was Ethan's signal, Reaper 0. It wasn't a promise of a dramatic rescue. It was something more valuable. It was a confirmation. I see it. I understand. Hold fast. That was all I needed. The fear that had been a cold knot in my stomach loosened its grip. I was not alone. The plan was in motion. I turned to face the MPs and held out my wrists, not in surrender, but in tactical compliance. Let them see me cuffed. Let Linda believe she had won. Let the whole world think I was broken. My father's voice echoed in my memory, a lesson he taught me long ago on that windy pier. In the eye of the storm, Lexi, be the calm. The bigger the storm, the more precious the stillness at its center becomes. And tonight, I was the eye of the storm. As they led me away, the crowd parted again, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, pity, and contempt. They were guiding me directly past Linda, another calculated move in her theatrical masterpiece, allowing her one final triumphant scene. She stepped forward, her face a mask of false compassion. She looked at me not with the gloating of a victor, but with the same feigned pity she had used to control me for 17 years. It was an expression that said, "See? You're nothing without me to protect you." It was the look she gave me when I failed, when I disappointed her, when I reminded her that I was not her blood. But this time was different. For the first time, I didn't look away. I didn't let my gaze fall to the polished marble floor. I met her eyes directly, holding them with a calm, empty stare. It was a void she couldn't read, an emptiness she couldn't manipulate. It was the blank, unblinking focus of a soldier who has already assessed the threat and is simply waiting for the moment to act. And in that fraction of a second, I saw it. For the first time in my life, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in Linda Steele's eyes, a tiny crack in her perfect composure. Her play had been executed to perfection, but she had made one critical miscalculation. She never considered that the lead actress had stopped reading from her script. Linda's words in that ballroom, "Your father would be so disappointed," weren't just a random cruelty. They were a key, unlocking a room in my memory I had tried to keep sealed for 17 years. As the MPs led me away, the flashing cameras and shocked faces faded, replaced by the scent of salt marsh and pine and the image of a 10-year-old girl standing alone on a wooden pier. Linda arrived at our house in Mount Pleasant 2 months after my father's funeral. I remember the exact moment her sedan pulled into our oak-lined driveway. Before I even saw her, I smelled her. Her perfume, a cloyingly sweet gardenia, rolled into the house like a fog, suffocating the familiar, comforting scent of pine wood and my dad's Old Spice that still lingered in the air. It was the smell of an invasion. She didn't hug me, the small, grieving child standing awkwardly in the foyer. She offered a thin, polite smile, and then her eyes began to scan the room, assessing every piece of furniture, every picture on the wall, not as a guest, but as a general surveying a battlefield she was about to conquer. Her conquest was silent and swift. There was no yelling, no overt cruelty that anyone on the outside would notice. Her weapon was erasure. In the first week, she had movers take away my father's favorite armchair. It was a worn, brown leather recliner, cracked in places, with a permanent indent where his head used to rest. It was the chair where he'd read me stories about brave knights and distant galaxies. "It's dreadfully outdated," she'd said to one of her friends on the phone, her voice light and dismissive. In its place appeared a stark white leather sofa, cold, sterile, and so perfect that no one ever dared to sit on it. Then came the curtains, the rugs, his collection of nautical maps. Piece by piece, she dismantled my world, systematically erasing every trace of my father, and she did it all with a serene, gracious smile. The old wooden pier behind our house, the place my dad and I used to go fishing, became my new classroom. Linda decided a young lady needed to be deft with her hands. This apparently meant mastering complex sailor's knots. For hours on end, she would make me stand out there, even as the cold, damp wind whipped in from Charleston Harbor, my small hands fumbling with a coarse length of rope. "The figure 8, Lexi. Make it perfect," she would command, her voice never rising above a calm, conversational tone. She never shouted. She didn't need to. She would just stand there, arms crossed, wrapped in an expensive cashmere shawl, her silent, unwavering gaze a heavier pressure than any scream could ever be. My fingers would grow numb, the rough rope chafing them raw until they bled. I tried to hide the tiny red specks on the sisal, terrified of her disapproval. I remember one afternoon, my hands were so cold I could barely feel them, and I dropped the coil of rope into the murky water below. It sank instantly. I looked up at her, my eyes wide with panic. She didn't say a word. She didn't scold me. She simply turned her back, walked into the house, and I heard the distinct click of the sliding glass door being locked. I was left outside, alone, as the sun went down and the tide began to recede. I had to wait for hours in the encroaching darkness, shivering, until the water was low enough for me to climb down the muddy bank and retrieve her precious rope. That night, huddled on the cold planks of the pier, I learned that the worst punishment isn't pain. It's the profound, terrifying loneliness of being utterly abandoned. Her cruelty was a performance art, and it was at its most brilliant when we had guests. In front of her friends from the Charleston Society pages, she was the model stepmother. She would pull me close, her hand stroking my hair in a gesture of affection that was as hollow as her praise. "Our Lexi is so self-reliant," she would say, her voice filled with warmth. "The girl never complains." Her friends would nod in admiration, looking at me with pity and approval. I would just stand there, forcing a small smile, a silent accomplice in her deception. They didn't see the calluses on my hands hidden in my pockets, or the emptiness in my eyes that I had learned to conceal. Linda's praise was just another weapon. It twisted my suffering into a virtue, my forced silence into willing consent. It was a constant, unspoken lesson. My value was directly proportional to how much pain I could endure without breaking. She trained me to be invisible, then praised me for mastering the art. The ultimate act of this performance came when I was 12. Linda founded the John Mills Hero Memorial Fund, using my father's name as her letterhead. She threw lavish fundraising galas at sprawling plantations, standing on stage under soft spotlights, speaking about my father's sacrifice with perfectly timed tears glistening in her eyes. The local papers and magazines lauded her as the devoted widow, the selfless mother, a pillar of the community. But I knew where the money was going. It wasn't to support military families, it was to build her own empire of influence, securing business deals for her associates and buying political favors. She had stolen my father's name, his honor, and twisted his sacrifice into a stepping stone for her own ambition. My father used to teach me about knots. "Every knot has a purpose, kiddo," he'd say, his voice warm and patient. "Some are meant to secure, to keep you safe. Others are meant to bind, to trap. You have to know which kind you're tying." That night, after one of her galas, I stood on that pier alone, the sound of the party still faintly echoing across the water. The wind was cold, but I barely felt it anymore. I looked out into the inky blackness of the Cooper River. I took a piece of rope and, with practiced, steady hands, tied a flawless bowline knot. It was a rescue knot, a knot used to save lives. And as I pulled it tight, I made a silent promise to my father, to the 10-year-old girl she had tried to erase. One day, I would use the very skills she had beaten into me, the patience, the precision, the ability to endure, to untie every single knot of deception she had ever created. If you've ever had a memory of a loved one twisted or used by someone else, please support this story by hitting the like button, and in the comments, just type the word honor. It will mean the world to me. I would not let her own my father's memory, and I would not let her own me. The promise I made to myself on that pier wasn't a fleeting, childish fantasy. It became the single, guiding principle of my existence. For the next 5 years, I endured. I perfected my invisibility. I mastered the art of silent compliance, all while hoarding the one thing Linda couldn't control: my resolve. The day after my 17th birthday, I acted on it. I told Linda I wanted to join the Army. She took me to the recruitment office herself. The sterile, fluorescent-lit room smelled of old coffee and patriotism, posters of stoic-looking soldiers plastered on every wall. Linda beamed at the recruiter, a weary-looking sergeant first class with more stripes on his sleeve than I had years in my life. "My daughter wants to follow in her father's footsteps," she announced, her voice resonating with the perfect pitch of maternal pride. It was a masterful, calculated lie. She didn't want me to be free. She wanted to transfer me from one cage to another, one she believed she could still control from a distance. She saw the military not as a path to liberation, but as a more structured, more unforgiving version of her own peer. She had done her research. With surgical precision, she guided me towards a specific military occupational specialty, 35S, Signals Intelligence Analyst. It was a field that demanded intense discipline, meticulous attention to detail, and long hours spent in highly secured, isolated facilities known as SCIFs. She imagined me locked away, drowning in pressure and loneliness, a broken little soldier she could still manipulate with care packages and guilt-laced letters. She thought the isolation would finally shatter me. What she didn't realize was that I had been living in isolation my entire life. She was sending me home. When the recruiter pushed the enlistment contract across the desk, I picked up the pen. My hand was perfectly steady. For Linda, my signature was a sentence. For me, it was a passport. Basic combat training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, was a thermal shock. The summer heat was a physical entity, a thick, humid blanket that clung to you from reveille to lights out. The air was a constant assault of drill sergeants' voices, raw and relentless, and the ever-present smell of sweat, pine needles, and industrial-grade soap. For many of the recruits, it was hell. For me, it was the freshest, cleanest air I had ever breathed. Here, there were no double meanings, no passive-aggressive silences, no praise that felt like a knife. The rules were brutally simple and completely transparent. If you messed up, you did push-ups until your arms screamed. The punishment was immediate, impartial, and finite. You paid your dues, you got back up, you drove on. For the first time in my life, I was part of a team, a real one. The survival of the person to my left and my right depended on me, and my survival depended on them. We were broken down and rebuilt together, our individuality stripped away and replaced with a collective identity. I had grown accustomed to enduring alone, but here I learned to endure together. On long ruck marches under the Carolina sun, when my legs felt like lead and my lungs burned, the shared misery became a strange sort of comfort. We were all in the same boat, all pushing through the same pain. And that made all the difference. My father once told me, "Discipline isn't a chain, Lexi. It's the wings that let you fly higher than you ever thought you could." In the crucible of Fort Jackson, I finally understood what he meant. The rigid structure that Linda thought would break me was actually giving me the freedom to fly. Advanced individual training for a SIGINT analyst was a different kind of challenge. It was a world of algorithms, encryption, and infinite patience. It was, in essence, an advanced version of tying knots on the pier. We were trained to sit for hours in front of screens, staring at waterfalls of data, listening to static, searching for the whispers, the anomalies, the tiny deviations in a signal pattern that could mean the difference between life and death for a team on the ground. The years Linda had forced me to focus on the minutiae of a knot, to endure mind-numbing repetition, had unintentionally forged me into the perfect analyst. I didn't just excel, I thrived. The other trainees saw tedious, boring work. I saw a puzzle. I didn't just learn the rules of signal identification. I learned the logic behind them, the theory of why certain frequencies behaved in certain ways. My mind, honed by years of deciphering Linda's moods and unspoken threats, found a home in the world of hidden meanings and classified information. I found a strange kind of power there. The power that comes from knowing what others don't, from seeing what remains hidden from plain sight. Linda had tried to teach me that power came from social status and manipulation. The Army taught me that true power came from knowledge and competence. I never called home. I didn't have to. Occasionally, a care package would arrive from Linda. It would be filled with uselessly expensive things: cashmere socks, gourmet chocolates, and a short, typed letter full of probing questions disguised as motherly concern. Are you working on anything interesting? Is your security clearance very high? I threw the chocolates in the barracks trash and never replied. Her attempts to maintain control felt pathetic and distant now, the actions of a queen whose kingdom had shrunk to a single, empty house. My connection to home was something far more real. Every night, before I went to sleep, I would take out my father's old dog tag from under my pillow. I'd run my thumb over the worn, smooth metal, feeling the slight dent on the edge where it must have hit something. It was scratched and faded, but it was the most valuable thing I owned. This was my true inheritance. Not Linda's fraudulent charity, not the cold white furniture in that Charleston house. It was this small, simple piece of stamped metal, a symbol of service, of honor, of a legacy she could never touch. It was a constant reminder of why I was there. I wasn't running away from Linda anymore. I was running towards the person I was meant to become. A person my father would be genuinely proud of. For years, the army was my sanctuary. It took me to Germany, to Korea, to dusty, forgotten outposts where my past felt like a distant country. The girl on the pier became a woman, a non-commissioned officer, a specialist in a field so classified that I couldn't even tell my own father about it if he were still alive. I had built a life, a career, and an identity on a foundation of competence and honor, a foundation Linda couldn't touch. Then, a new assignment brought me back, not just to the States, but to a joint task force operating out of Charleston. The gilded cage was waiting. The house in Mount Pleasant was almost unrecognizable. The familiar scent of pine and salt was gone, completely replaced by the heavy, oppressive smell of wealth. A blend of expensive Cuban cigars, imported lilies, and the faint, acrid odor of ambition. The stark white furniture, I remembered, was now complemented by abstract art on the walls and powerful people mingling in the living room. It was no longer a cold house, it was a showroom, a stage for Linda's influence. She greeted me at the door, dressed in a silk gown that probably cost more than my first car. She wrapped her arms around me in a brief, airy hug that was more for the benefit of her guests than for me. "Welcome home, my hero," she whispered, the words brushing against my ear. She used the word hero as if it were a pet name, but it felt like a brand, a label she was eager to display. When she pulled back, her eyes didn't meet mine. They scanned my uniform, lingering for a moment on the ribbons and medals adorning my chest. The Army Commendation Medal, the Good Conduct Medal, the Overseas Service Ribbon. She wasn't seeing her stepdaughter. She was seeing a new, valuable asset, a tool far more potent than the broken little girl she once disciplined with a length of rope. My return was her new favorite project. She orchestrated a welcome home hero party that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with her. The guest list was a who's who of the Low Country's power brokers, defense contractors, state senators, real estate tycoons. I stood in my dress blues, a living, breathing centerpiece for her event, as she paraded me around the room. "This is my daughter Lexi," she would announce, her voice resonating with carefully rehearsed sincerity. "She's doing such incredible things for our country." When the photographers from the local society magazine arrived, she would stand beside me, placing a proprietary hand on my shoulder. It was a gesture of ownership disguised as affection. To the outside world, we were the picture of a proud, patriotic military family, a devoted mother celebrating her daughter's service. But I could feel the invisible bars of the cage closing in around me. Linda no longer needed ropes and locked doors to control me. Her new weapons were far more sophisticated: social expectation, public perception, and the weight of my own uniform. She had turned my service into a symbol, and a symbol has no voice of its own. During the rare moments we were alone, usually over sterile dinners at a long dining table where my father's chair used to be, her questions became sharper, more focused. They were always wrapped in the guise of motherly interest, a performance of someone trying to understand her child's complex career. "That project you're on, does it involve the new satellite systems?" she'd ask casually while slicing into her filet mignon. "Your security clearance, does that give you access to logistics data, supply chain movements, She would ask with a gentle, curious smile, as if inquiring about a new hobby. But I wasn't the girl on the pier anymore. I was an analyst trained to detect patterns, to find the signal in the noise. And I saw the pattern in her inquiries. She wasn't interested in my life. She was mapping the scope and limitations of my access. She was drawing a treasure map, and my security clearance was the key. I would give her vague, non-committal answers, citing classification protocols, and watch a flicker of frustration pass behind her eyes before the gracious smile returned. The game had changed, but it was still a game. It was during a joint training exercise at Fort Bragg that I first met Master Sergeant Ethan Graves. He was part of a special operations support team, a quiet, intense man who moved with an economy of motion that spoke of immense competence. He said little, but when he did, everyone listened. Our units were running a complex signals intelligence drill when Linda made a surprise visit, ostensibly to bring the troops some homemade cookies, which were, of course, catered. She charmed everyone, as she always did. My commanding officer was captivated. The younger soldiers were in awe of her southern grace. She moved through our tactical operations center like a visiting dignitary, a whirlwind of perfume and charisma. But Ethan was unimpressed. He watched her for a moment, his eyes analytical. When she approached him with a dazzling smile and an outstretched plate of cookies, he simply gave a polite, professional nod. "No, thank you, ma'am," he said, and immediately turned his attention back to the tactical map on the screen. He dismissed her as easily and efficiently as he would dismiss a piece of irrelevant data. Later that day, as we were breaking down our equipment, he walked over to me. I braced myself for the usual comments. "Your mother is so charming," or "It's so great that she's so supportive." Instead, he just looked at me with his steady, unreadable gaze and said in his low, gravelly voice, "Your stepmom. She talks a lot." It wasn't a criticism or an insult. It was a simple, factual observation from a man who analyzed the world for a living. He had looked at Linda and, in less than 5 minutes, had seen through the entire performance. He saw the noise, not the signal. For the first time since my return, I felt like someone saw me, not the hero, not the daughter, not the prop. They just saw a soldier. From that day on, I knew I had an ally. Someone else who saw the world not for what it pretended to be, but for what it was. Knowing I had an ally in Ethan didn't change Linda's game, but it changed how I played it. I was no longer just enduring her manipulations. I was analyzing them, logging them, searching for the pattern. The vague sense of unease she always created had sharpened into a clear, defined threat assessment. The confirmation of that threat came on a Tuesday night. I had stopped by the house to pick up some old yearbooks from the attic for a friend's reunion. Linda was in her home office, a room that used to be my father's study. The door was slightly ajar. I was about to announce my presence when I heard her voice, low and sharp, stripped of its usual southern charm. It was her real voice, the one I rarely heard. "Don't worry," she purred into the phone. "Our investment is about to mature. The pawn is in place and ready to be sacrificed." I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. A cold wave washed over me, starting in my gut and spreading through my veins. Investment. Pawn. Sacrificed. The words were clinical, detached, utterly devoid of emotion. And there was no doubt who she was talking about. All the pieces clicked into place. This was never just about using my image for social climbing. It was a long, calculated operation. The nausea was immediate and overwhelming, the taste of betrayal bitter in my mouth. But right behind it came something else. A cold, stark clarity. The kind I only felt on a mission when the objective became crystal clear. The enemy was no longer a shadowy figure. She had a name and a voice. The battle had officially begun. I backed away from the door as silently as I came, my footsteps making no sound on the thick Persian rug. The game had just changed. And she had no idea. That night, back in the sterile quiet of my barracks room, I used a military-grade encrypted messaging app on a secure laptop. I sent a message to Ethan. It contained only 2 words. Need to talk. 30 seconds later, a reply appeared on my screen. A set of coordinates and a time. no questions asked. The coordinates led me to a small, dimly lit coffee shop on a quiet side street in Folly Beach, the kind of place locals go to avoid tourists. It smelled of roasted coffee beans and salty sea air. Ethan was already there, sitting in a booth in the back corner, a plain black coffee untouched in front of him. He looked up as I approached, his expression as impassive as ever. I slid into the booth across from him, and the words just came tumbling out. I told him everything. About Linda's years of subtle manipulation, her increasingly specific questions about my work, and the phone call I just overheard. I laid out the facts like I was giving a mission briefing, trying to keep my voice steady, professional. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer sympathy, didn't react at all. His eyes, however, were locked on mine, focused with an intensity that told me he was absorbing and analyzing every single word. When I finally finished, the only sound was the low hum of the espresso machine. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Okay," he said, his voice calm and level. "From this moment on, we document everything. Let her think she's in control. You're going to feed her, give her pieces of information. Nothing classified, nothing damaging, but things that seem valuable. We're setting a net." So I became a double agent in my own life. I started playing Linda's game by her rules, but with my own objective. The next time we had dinner, she casually asked about a new communications system the Army was testing. I pretended to hesitate, feigning concern about classification. Then, I relented, giving her details that were technically accurate but had already been published in a dozen defense industry journals. I presented it as a secret I was reluctantly sharing. I saw the glint of triumph in her eyes. She thought she was turning me, peeling back the layers of my military discipline to get to the prize inside. Her confidence grew with each piece of bait I dropped. She was so focused on her own game that she never once thought to ask if she was being played. Meanwhile, Ethan and I were building our own intelligence operation. He set up a discrete monitoring system, flagging any communications, calls, emails, financial transactions that involved Linda or any of her known associates. The name that kept surfacing was Atlantic Forge, a shadowy defense contractor with a reputation for cutting corners and a history of failed government bids. Now, they were suddenly winning contracts, big ones. The net was in place, the bait was taken. We just had to wait for her to make her final move. It came a week before the Army ball. An urgent email appeared in my inbox. It looked official, sent from an internal Army domain, complete with the right logos and formatting. It stated that due to a system-wide update, all personnel with my level of clearance needed to immediately re-authenticate their security credentials via a provided link. My training screamed at me, phishing attack. It was a trap. But it was the most sophisticated one I'd ever seen. I immediately forwarded it to Ethan. He analyzed the link in a secure digital sandbox. His response came back in under an hour. The link led to a cloned portal designed to steal my login credentials. But it did something else, something far more sinister. Once the credentials were entered, it would trigger a silent script that would use my account to send a massive burst of classified data to an external server. It would simultaneously trip every security alarm in the system, all under my name, my digital signature. That's when we understood her endgame. She didn't just want information, she wanted to destroy me. She needed a scapegoat, a traitor to take the fall when Atlantic Forge's illicit gains came to light. The Army ball was to be her stage, the grand finale where the hero she created would be spectacularly revealed as a villain. She had written the perfect play, and we decided we were going to let her perform it. The Gaillard Center ballroom glittered like a captured galaxy. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto a sea of dress uniforms and silk gowns. To everyone else, it was a dream. To me, it was a meticulously staged battlefield, and I was standing at ground zero. I held a flute of champagne, the bubbles rising and popping in a silent countdown. Across the room, I watched Linda move through the crowd. She was in her element, a vision in an emerald silk dress that shimmered under the lights like the skin of a serpent. This was her kingdom. My eyes scanned the perimeter, my training taking over. In a shadowed corner near the bar, I spotted them. A trio of executives from Atlantic Forge, their expensive suits looking out of place amongst the military decorations. They were in a low, intense conversation with the same man in a dark suit I'd seen earlier, the bought and paid for federal agent. All the pieces were on the board. A single, soft click in my earpiece. Ethan. His voice was calm, almost detached. Game on. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the taste of champagne sharp on my tongue. I was ready for the storm. The accusation, when it came, shattered the dreamlike atmosphere. The agent from Atlantic Forge's huddle strode to the stage, taking the microphone from the master of ceremonies. The polite applause died down, replaced by a confused murmur. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He let the silence stretch for a beat, ensuring he had everyone's complete attention. Then, he spoke my name. Sergeant Lexi Mills, you are under investigation for a breach of national security. A tidal wave of silence crashed over the room. It was absolute, a dead vacuum of sound far more terrifying than the silence on the pier. That silence was between Linda and me. This silence was between me and the world. Hundreds of eyes, like the lenses of cameras, turned to pin me in their collective gaze. I saw the blinding flash of a camera from the press section, then another, and another. My face, my uniform, my name. All captured in a single, damning moment. I scanned the crowd, desperately searching for a single friendly face, a flicker of doubt or sympathy. I found none. All I saw was shock, morbid curiosity, and the slow dawning horror of contempt. I saw young lieutenants, men and women I had mentored, whose respect I'd worked so hard to earn, turn their faces away, their expressions a mixture of disappointment and disgust. Through it all, I could see Linda. She stood among a group of generals' wives, a perfect Oscar-worthy performance of a heartbroken mother. Her hand was pressed to her chest, her eyes wide with a believable, devastating sorrow. In that moment, she had won. She had successfully painted me as the enemy in a room full of my brothers and sisters in arms. My oath of enlistment flashed in my mind. I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I looked at Linda, at the architects of my destruction, and I realized I was staring at a domestic enemy, one wrapped in silk and Chanel No. 5. The two MPs reached me. One was an older master sergeant I recognized from the provost marshal's office, a good man. His face was a mask of stern professionalism, but I could see the profound disappointment in his eyes. It was a look that hurt more than any accusation. Sergeant Mills, he said, his voice low and formal, please place your hands behind your back. The sharp click-clack of the handcuffs opening echoed in the dead silence. It sounded as loud as a rifle shot, the sound of my honor being shackled. I felt the cold, unforgiving steel bite into my wrists. It was a familiar sensation from training exercises, but this time it was different. This was real. This was Linda's victory made manifest, a cold metal symbol of her triumph. I didn't resist. I didn't say a word. I stood tall, my spine straight, my chin up. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I had to trust Ethan. I had to trust the plan. But in that moment, standing alone, publicly shamed, surrounded by the condemning eyes of my peers, faith was a fragile, flickering flame in a hurricane. They turned me to lead me out, and the path they chose was, of course, directly past Linda. She stepped forward as if to offer a final, comforting word. Her movements were fluid, graceful, every gesture designed for maximum emotional impact on the watching crowd. She placed a hand on my arm, a touch that was meant to look gentle, but felt like a brand. She leaned in close, her gardenia perfume filling my senses. Her voice a venomous whisper meant only for me. You see, Lexi, I told you. You could never win against me. She hissed, her lips barely moving. Her sweet public face was inches from mine, but her eyes were chips of ice. Now the whole world knows you're just a disappointment, just like your father always thought you were. That was the final twist of the knife. The most cruel, calculated blow she could deliver. Using the memory of the one person I loved, the man whose honor I had tried to uphold my entire life, as her final weapon. A hot surge of tears burned the back of my eyes. a wave of pure, raw grief and rage that threatened to drown me. I felt my composure crack, but I held on. I swallowed the tears, pushed them back down into the cold, hard place inside me, where I kept all the other pain she had given me. No, I would not let her see it. I would not give her that. If you believe that a person's honor is the one thing no one should ever be able to take away, please show your support by hitting the like button and type "hold fast" in the comments below. This battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. Miles away from the glittering nightmare unfolding in Charleston, the only light in a windowless room deep inside Fort Bragg came from the cold blue glow of 24 computer monitors. This was the Tactical Operations Center, the TOC, the nerve center of a unit that didn't officially exist. Here, the air was cool and smelled of ozone from the humming servers. The currency wasn't money or influence, it was data. And Master Sergeant Ethan Graves was staring at the single piece of data that mattered most. On his primary monitor, 2 strings of authentication code were displayed side by side in stark green text. To the untrained eye, they were identical, a meaningless jumble of characters. But Ethan's eyes were trained to see the invisible, the subtle tells that an enemy leaves behind. Run the packet analysis again. Cross-reference timestamp deviations, he ordered, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the urgency of the situation. It cut cleanly through the quiet hum of the climate control systems and the soft clicking of keyboards. He didn't look away from the screen, his focus absolute. Beside him, a young SIGINT analyst, a specialist barely out of his advanced training but with a preternatural talent for code, responded without missing a beat. His fingers flew across a keyboard, bringing up cascading windows of raw data. "Running it now, Master Sergeant," he confirmed. The seconds stretched, each one feeling like a minute. "Got it," the analyst finally said, his voice tight with discovery. "Confirmed. Latency deviation of 2.1 milliseconds in the authentication handshake. The packets were rerouted through a third-party server. Pinging the IP now, it's registered to a shell company in Estonia." That was it. The digital fingerprint, the microscopic yet irrefutable proof that the security alert triggered under Sergeant Lexi Mills's name was a sophisticated forgery. It was the whisper in the static they had been waiting for, the anomaly that confirmed the entire operation was a setup. Ethan's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his large frame casting a shadow over the communications console. He keyed in a command on his own terminal, bringing up a secure protocol file. "Initiate Operation Iron Tide," he said. His voice was steady, almost monotone, but it carried the absolute weight of a command that set a complex and powerful machine into motion. In an instant, the atmosphere in the TOC shifted. The quiet hum of observation was replaced by the focused, efficient silence of action. Red lights blinked on a status board, and operators began executing their pre-assigned roles. The counteroffensive had begun. While one team was tasked with preparing a rapid response unit, Ethan swiveled his chair to a massive, wall-mounted monitor. With a few keystrokes, he replaced the satellite imagery with a complex web of financial transactions, a spider web of lines connecting dozens of accounts across the globe. For weeks, he and a small team of forensic accountants had been meticulously tracking the shadowy finances of Atlantic Forge, following a convoluted trail of shell corporations and offshore transfers designed to launder money and hide its source. Now, with the security alert triggered, the event they had predicted, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. He watched in real time as a transaction completed. 20 minutes ago, a payment of 7 figures had been transferred from an Atlantic Forge subsidiary to a holding company in Delaware. That company, in turn, instantly funneled the money to a private investment account at a boutique bank in Charleston. The name on the account, Linda Steele. It was the kill shot, the direct, undeniable link between the corporate entity and the architect of the frame-up. "Get me a hard copy of that entire transaction chain, from origin to destination," Ethan commanded the financial analyst across the room. "We have her." The digital trail was clean, a perfect breadcrumb path that no lawyer could explain away. Linda's empire was built on a foundation of public image and carefully crafted lies, but it was about to be brought down by a handful of numbers on a screen. Simultaneously, at a discreet forward operating base tucked away in the marshlands just outside of Charleston, 6 men received a single, encrypted alert on their tactical devices. The alert read simply, "Iron Tide, go." They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They moved as one organism, with the silent, fluid precision that comes from hundreds of missions together in places the world would never know about. They were ghosts, trained to materialize, solve a problem with overwhelming and precise force, and vanish without a trace. Each man donned his tactical gear: black fatigues, body armor, helmets with integrated comms, and night vision optics. They checked the seals on their gas masks, the quiet hiss of compressed air the only sound in the room. With practiced efficiency, they chambered rounds in their suppressed M4 carbines, the soft clack of the bolt sliding home a familiar, comforting sound. They filed out into the humid South Carolina night air and climbed into 2 black, unmarked SUVs that looked like they belonged to a suburban soccer dad, not an elite military unit. The team leader, a man known only by his call sign, Preacher, studied a digital, 3-dimensional map of the Gaillard Center on a tablet mounted to his chest rig. "Reaper Zero wants a silent perimeter," he said into his throat mic, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that was barely audible over the engine's hum. "Hard seal on all exits. No one in, nobody out, until we get the green light. Weapons tight. This is a snatch and grab, not a firefight." His team members responded with a series of single clicks over the comms, their version of "Roger that." The ghosts of Charleston were moving into position. Back in the talk at Fort Bragg, Ethan monitored a dozen feeds at once. He had live access to the Gaillard Center's internal security cameras, a thermal feed from a small silent reconnaissance drone hovering high above the building, and the encrypted body cam footage from Preacher's team as they silently took up positions around the ballroom's service entrances. He watched the chaos unfold inside the grand hall. He saw the flash of cameras as Lexi was accused. He saw her stand tall, her expression a mask of military discipline. He saw her being placed in handcuffs, a sight that made his grip on his coffee mug tighten. He saw Linda, the grieving mother, accepting condolences from horrified guests, playing her role to perfection. He waited. He was a patient hunter. He let the scene play out, allowing Linda's performance to reach its crescendo. He didn't want to just interrupt her play. He wanted to bring the entire theater crashing down around her on stage, in front of her entire audience of powerful people. He watched as the MPs began to escort Lexi toward the main exit, right past where Linda was standing. The trap was about to be sprung. "Perimeter is set. We are in position." Preacher's voice crackled in Ethan's ear, clear as a bell. "All assets are go, awaiting your command, Reaper Zero." Ethan picked up his microphone, his knuckles white. His gaze was fixed on the monitor showing a close-up of Linda leaning in to whisper in Lexi's ear. He saw the flicker of pain on Lexi's face, a crack in her soldier's mask. That was enough. He keyed the mic. "All units," he said, and his cold, clear voice was broadcast across every secure channel, from the talk to the men waiting in the wings in Charleston. "Go. Execute." The cold steel of the handcuffs was just about to close on my second wrist. The final metallic click of my public execution was a fraction of a second away. Then the grand oak doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open. But not with a crash or a bang. They opened silently, pushed by an unseen, irresistible force. 6 shadows detached themselves from the doorway and flowed into the room. They were dressed in full tactical gear, black fatigues, helmets, and weapons held in a low-ready position. They moved with a terrifying synchronized grace, like a pack of wolves, spreading out to cover all angles of the room. They didn't shout. They didn't point their weapons at anyone. They simply existed, and their silent, overwhelming presence sucked all the air and noise out of the ballroom. The whispers died. The camera flashes stopped. The entire glittering assembly of Charleston's elite was frozen in stunned silence. The military police officer holding my arm stopped mid-motion, his hand hovering, his face a mask of utter confusion. And for the first time that night, I saw the mask of serene confidence on Linda's face shatter. It was replaced by a raw, primal confusion that quickly curdled into fear. She didn't understand what was happening. This wasn't part of her script. Ethan Graves was the last one through the door. He wasn't in tactical gear. He wore a standard operational camouflage uniform, sleeves neatly rolled, a stark contrast to the formal attire of the ball. He walked with a calm, deliberate purpose, his boots making no sound on the marble floor. His eyes were fixed on me, and he didn't spare a single glance for anyone else in the room. Not the generals, not the senators, not Linda. He walked a straight line through the parted sea of guests and stopped directly in front of me. He looked at me, then at the MP still holding my arm. He spoke, his voice not loud, but carrying an authority that cut through the silence and commanded total obedience. "Sergeant Mills," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "We're here." 4 simple words, but in that room, at that moment, they shifted the entire balance of power. The authority wasn't on the stage anymore. It was standing right in front of me. Ethan then turned his gaze to the MP. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't issue a command. He simply made a statement that was not open for debate. "Let my soldier go." The MP, a man who an hour ago would have demanded Ethan's rank and unit, simply nodded and fumbled for the key to the handcuffs. The cuffs fell away from my wrists with a soft clatter. I rubbed the raw skin, the feeling slowly returning to my hands. Ethan placed a hand on my shoulder, a firm, grounding gesture of solidarity. It wasn't pity. It was respect. It was a silent apology for what I had been forced to endure. "Welcome back, Sergeant," he said, his voice low. The simple act, the simple words, felt more powerful than any presidential pardon. It was a restoration of honor. As I took a half step back, Preacher, the silent team leader, materialized at Ethan's side and handed him a ruggedized military tablet. Ethan took it and gave a curt nod toward the stage. A technician who had entered with the team tapped a few keys on a laptop, and the massive projection screen behind the stage, which had been displaying the elegant logo of the Army Ball, flickered and came to life. It was now showing a direct feed from the Tausi at Fort Bragg. The first image that appeared was the 2 strings of code, one highlighted in green, one in red. The 2.1 millisecond latency deviation was circled, with technical annotations explaining its significance. A collective, confused murmur went through the crowd. Then the screen changed. It now displayed the intricate web of financial transactions, a clear, damning flowchart showing the 7-figure payment moving from Atlantic Forge through the Delaware Shell Company and landing squarely in a private account under the name Linda Steele. A single, unified gasp swept through the ballroom. It was a sound of collective, dawning comprehension. I looked over at Linda. Her face had gone chalk white. The champagne flute she was holding slipped from her nerveless fingers and shattered on the marble floor. The sound, sharp and final, was the sound of her entire world breaking apart. It was the sound of the fall. Ethan walked calmly onto the stage and picked up the microphone. The authority that radiated from him was absolute. "By authorization of the United States Army Special Operations Command," he began, his voice amplified, clear and cold as ice, resonating through every corner of the silent hall. "Operation Irontide is currently underway to neutralize an active threat to domestic security. All allegations against Sergeant Lexi Mills are hereby declared void. They are the result of a malicious intelligence operation." He paused, letting the words sink in, his eyes scanning the crowd of powerful faces, many of whom were now looking at Linda with dawning horror and betrayal. "The investigation," Ethan continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming even more menacing, "will now focus on Mrs. Linda Steele and her associates at Atlantic Forge for conspiracy to commit espionage against the United States." He placed the microphone back on the lectern with a soft, final thud. There was no triumph in his voice, no gloating. Just the cold, hard, and irrefutable precision of the truth. I stood there, my wrists free, the blood slowly starting to return to my hands. I looked at Linda. The powerful, manipulative predator was gone. In her place was just a small, trembling woman in a ridiculously expensive dress, standing alone in the wreckage of the empire of lies she'd so carefully constructed. Her stage had become her prison. The controlled chaos of the raid subsided as quickly as it had begun, replaced by a different kind of order. The ballroom, once a stage for social theater, was now a secured crime scene. Army Criminal Investigation Division agents, or CID, moved through the dazed and silent crowd with quiet, methodical purpose. They weren't soldiers equipped for assault. They were investigators in suits, their authority just as absolute but wielded with clipboards and quiet questions instead of rifles. They began taping off sections of the room, their movements calm and orderly, restoring a sense of structure to the shattered evening. I watched as two CID agents, a man and a woman, both with the weary, patient eyes of career cops, approached Linda. She stood frozen beside a half-empty champagne fountain, a solitary figure in her emerald green dress, which now looked garish and out of place. She didn't scream. She didn't protest. The fight had completely drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow shell. All the power she had projected, all the influence she'd wielded, had evaporated in the face of cold, hard facts on a projection screen. Mrs. Linda Steele, the female agent said, her voice professional and devoid of any emotion. It was not an accusation, it was a statement of fact. You are under arrest on suspicion of espionage, conspiracy, and acts against the United States of America. The agent gestured for Linda to turn around, and she complied, her movements stiff and robotic. The agent then cuffed her hands behind her back. I heard the sound again. That sharp, metallic click-clack, the same sound that had echoed through the hall when they had come for me. The same cold steel that had touched my skin was now closing around hers. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a moment of symmetry. A circle, started 17 years ago on a windswept pier, had finally, irrevocably, closed. As Linda was being led away, Preacher, his face still an unreadable mask, approached Ethan and me. He spoke into his comms, listened for a moment, then lowered his radio. He spoke to Ethan, but his voice was loud enough for me to hear. Simultaneous targets are secure, Reaper 0. CEO of Atlantic Forge was apprehended at his home in Kiowa Island. The compromised federal agent and 2 associates were picked up downtown. The entire network is down. It had all happened in less than 15 minutes. An empire that Linda had spent a lifetime building, constructed on a complex scaffolding of relationships, favors, intimidation, and stolen money, had been dismantled with the speed and precision of a military operation. It had crumbled like a house of cards in a sudden gust of wind. It was a stark, brutal lesson in the nature of power. The kind of power Linda had was fragile, based on perception and deception. It was no match for the truth. I stood beside Ethan, a silent observer to the dismantling of my own past. A part of me, a part of what the guests and even my own commanders expected, was supposed to feel something. Elation, vengeance, a fist-pumping sense of victory. But I felt none of that. Instead, there was just a vast, quiet emptiness, a strange and profound silence in my soul. The war that had defined my entire life, the conflict that had shaped every decision I'd ever made, was over. It was like a soldier returning from a long deployment. You spend so long living with the constant noise of battle that the sudden silence of peace can be more deafening, more disorienting than any explosion. Ethan glanced at me, his analytical eyes seeming to understand the complex emptiness I was feeling. "It's okay, Sergeant," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "Peace takes some getting used to." They led Linda past us on their way to the exit. Our paths crossed one final time. She stopped for a brief second, her escort pausing with her. The arrogant, calculating mask was gone completely now. All that remained was a shattered, bewildered woman who couldn't comprehend how her perfect world had come undone. Her eyes, filled not with hatred but with a desperate, narcissistic confusion, locked onto mine. "Why?" she asked, her voice a raw, broken whisper. It was the question a true narcissist would ask, a question born not of a desire to understand, but of an inability to accept failure. She wasn't asking for my reasons. She was blaming me for her downfall. She couldn't comprehend how her perfect plan, her flawless script, had failed. For years, a question like that from her would have sent me spiraling, searching for a way to justify my existence, to earn her approval. But now I just looked back at her, and this time, my silence wasn't born of fear. It was a choice. I had spent my life craving serenity, the courage to change the things I can, the wisdom to know the difference. I had changed what I could. Now it was time for serenity. I didn't owe her an explanation. I didn't owe her anger. I didn't owe her anything at all. The debt had been paid. I simply held her gaze for a moment, then turned away, leaving her alone with her question. A question she would spend the rest of her life unable to answer. Because the answer wasn't for her. It was for me. Because I deserved to be free. 3 days after the army ball, a fragile peace settled over Charleston. The storm had passed. The sensational headlines about the Charleston Society spy were already fading, replaced by the next news cycle. Linda's case had been handed over to the federal prosecutors, and her name, once a symbol of power and grace, was now just a file in a government office. The world had moved on. And for the first time, I felt like I could too. I found myself walking alone along the waterfront park, the salty breeze from the harbor gently tugging at my hair. In the distance, across the shimmering expanse of the Cooper River, I could just make out the familiar silhouette of the Mount Pleasant shoreline, where the old pier still stood. It was the same view I had seen 1,000 times, but today, it looked different. The landscape of my past was still there, but it no longer held any power over me. The wind no longer carried the chilling memory of punishment and isolation. It was just the wind, tasting of salt and freedom, carrying the lonely, hopeful cries of seagulls. I stopped and leaned against the cool, sturdy metal of the railing, my hands gripping it tightly. I ran my palms along its smooth surface, feeling its solid, unyielding presence beneath my fingers. There were no ropes here, no more knots to tie, no more knots to untangle. There was just the wide open expanse of the water and the sky. There was just freedom. A familiar, quiet presence approached from behind. I didn't need to turn to know it was Ethan. He stopped beside me, leaning on the railing, following my gaze out to the water. We stood in comfortable silence for a few moments before he spoke. "This came to command for you," he said, holding out a thick manila envelope. It looked old, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges. I took it from him, my brow furrowed in confusion. The return address was from a small local law firm I'd never heard of. I carefully opened the flap. Inside was a letter and a sheaf of financial statements. The letterhead read, "The John Mills Memorial Scholarship Fund." My heart skipped a beat. It turned out that before my father had deployed for the last time, he had used a small inheritance to set up a modest trust. His instructions were simple: to provide small scholarships for the children of fallen service members from his unit. An old, semi-retired lawyer, a friend of his from way back, had been quietly administering it all these years, just as my father had asked. It wasn't a massive, glittering foundation like the one Linda had built. It was small, unassuming, and utterly real. The statements showed a history of small grants, a few thousand for textbooks here, a little more for tuition there, that had helped dozens of kids over the years. Linda had created a loud, hollow, fraudulent version to serve her own ambition, but my father's true legacy had endured, silent, humble, and honest. It had been working quietly in the background of my life all along, a testament to the man he truly was. A slow smile spread across my face. It felt foreign at first, an unfamiliar stretching of muscles. It was the first real smile I had smiled in a very, very long time. And in that moment, looking at the simple, typed pages, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. "I don't think of it as a victory," I said softly, still looking out at the water, the letter clutched in my hand. Ethan turned his head slightly, listening. "Victory always seems so loud in the movies, parades, and cheering. This is quiet." He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "That's the sound of the truth, Lexi," he replied, his voice a low rumble beside me. "It doesn't need to shout." We stood there for a long time, two soldiers sharing a moment of quiet peace. There were no grand declarations, no Hollywood promises of a future together. There was just a profound, unspoken respect between two people who had been through a war and understood the precious value of the ceasefire that followed. It was a bond forged not in romance, but in the crucible of a shared mission. And it was stronger than any I had ever known. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and purple, I finally pushed myself away from the railing. I turned my back on the harbor, on the pier, on the ghosts of the past. The 10-year-old girl who had shivered in the cold, tying knots with bleeding fingers, was no longer there. In her place stood a woman, a soldier, a survivor. My steps on the cobblestone path were steady and even. I wasn't rushing toward anything, nor was I running away. For the first time, I was simply walking at my own pace, in my own time. I stopped, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath. A breath that started deep in my belly and filled my lungs until they felt like they would burst. I held it for a moment, savoring the clean, salty taste of the air, the taste of a life that was now entirely my own. Then I let it out, a long, slow release of 17 years of tension, of fear, of grief. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it is simply the quiet, steady space that allows you to finally breathe. And in that silence, in that single, perfect breath, my story had finally found its end. And its beginning. And that breath, that was the first of many. My story is proof that the knots tied by others do not have to define you. It's about finding the courage to pick them apart, one thread at a time, until you can finally breathe again. Your worth was never in their hands to begin with. If my journey has resonated with you, please help this message reach others by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. And if you know someone who might be feeling trapped in their own silence, consider sharing this story with them. Sometimes just knowing you're not alone is the sound of truth. Thank you for listening.